My dad said, family comes first. Then I watched him inject my diabetic sister's insulin into his own arm. I was 15 when I walked into the bathroom at 2 a.m. and found my father sitting on the closed toilet lid with a tourniquet around his bicep. Mia's insulin pen was in his other hand. The needle was already in his vein. He looked up at me with dilated pupils and said nothing, just stared. Then slowly removed the needle and walked past me like I was invisible, like I hadn't just witnessed him stealing medication that kept my 12-year-old sister alive. I stood there frozen, listening to his bedroom door close down the hall. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the sink. That image burned itself into my brain. The next morning, he made pancakes like nothing had happened. Mia sat at the kitchen table checking her blood sugar before eating. The meter read 287, dangerously high for a fasting glucose level. She frowned and reached for her insulin pen to correct it. Dad was at the stove flipping pancakes and humming. I watched him closely. Watched how he didn't react to Mia's high reading. Didn't ask if she needed help calculating her correction dose. Didn't show any concern that her numbers had been climbing steadily for weeks. He just served breakfast and ate in silence, while Mia administered her own insulin and tried to figure out why her diabetes was suddenly so uncontrollable. Mia had been type 1 diabetic since she was 8 years old. 4 years of our family revolving around her medical needs. Monthly pharmacy runs, insulin pens stored carefully in the fridge, emergency glucose tablets in every room, blood sugar checks before meals, before bed, before sports. We all knew the routine by heart. Mom had been meticulous about Mia's care before she died 2 years ago. Dad had seemed to take over seamlessly, or so I thought. Now I was realizing I had no idea what was actually happening with Mia's medical management when I wasn't watching. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The insulin supply that disappeared too quickly. Mia's confused complaints about feeling shaky and dizzy constantly, despite taking her medication. The way Dad got defensive whenever I asked questions about her treatment. How he'd started picking up her prescriptions alone instead of letting me come along. How he'd begun insisting that Mia's endocrinologist was overreacting to her lab results. Small things that individually seemed explainable. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. That afternoon, I checked the medication drawer in our kitchen, where we kept Mia's diabetes supplies. We should have had at least 10 insulin pens from the refill Dad picked up 5 days ago. I counted 3, all of them nearly empty. The prescription bottle showed he'd collected a 30-day supply, 27 pens total. Only 3 remained after less than a week. Either Mia was using insulin at 10 times her prescribed rate, or Dad was taking it somewhere else. I thought about what I'd seen at 2 a.m. The tourniquet, the injection, his empty expression. I pulled out my phone and photographed everything. The nearly empty drawer, the prescription label showing the pickup date, the 3 remaining pens. I didn't know what I was documenting yet. Just an instinct that I needed evidence. Then I put everything back exactly how I found it and waited for Dad to come home. He arrived around 6 p.m. smelling like cigarettes and something chemical I couldn't identify. His pupils were dilated again. He went straight to the kitchen and opened the medication drawer. Stood there staring at the 3 pens for a long moment, then closed the drawer and went to his room without speaking to either of us. Mia collapsed during PE class the next day. The school nurse called me first because Dad wasn't answering his phone. By the time I got there, Mia was conscious but barely coherent. Her blood sugar had spiked to 412, diabetic ketoacidosis territory, the kind of high that can cause coma or death if not treated immediately. The nurse had already called an ambulance. Mia was crying and asking why her insulin wasn't working, why her body was betraying her, why she couldn't control her diabetes anymore when she was doing everything right. I held her hand and lied, told her everything would be okay, but I already knew what was wrong. Dad finally showed up at the hospital 3 hours later. The emergency room doctor was explaining to Mia that her A1C levels indicated months of poorly controlled diabetes, that her current crisis was the result of consistent inadequate insulin coverage, that something in her treatment regimen needed to change immediately. Dad nodded along and asked questions that sounded concerned, talked about how confusing teenage diabetes management could be. The doctor looked skeptical but couldn't argue with a parent who seemed engaged and knowledgeable. They adjusted Mia's prescription and sent us home with instructions for better monitoring. In the car, Dad turned to Mia and said her medical crisis had been embarrassing, that she needed to learn to manage her condition more discreetly, that calling ambulances and making scenes at school reflected poorly on our family. Mia apologized through tears, said she'd try harder to control her blood sugar. I stared at Dad's profile while he drove and realized I was sitting next to a stranger. The father I thought I knew wouldn't blame a 12-year-old for a diabetic emergency, wouldn't make her feel ashamed for nearly dying. This person wearing my father's face was someone else entirely. That night, I went through Dad's room while he was passed out on the couch, found his phone unlocked next to him, opened his messages and started scrolling. What I found made my hands shake so badly, I almost dropped the phone. Full story is linked below or on my channel.